Hello everyone. This presentation will be on hemolytic anemias. The slides are made available online as a part of the UG teaching modules 2015-16 by the Indian Academy of Pediatrics. Now, as the term itself suggests, anemia is a deficiency of red cell or hemoglobin or both. Hemolytic can be further split into hemo referring to blood and lytic meaning destruction. So, destruction of the RBCs. By definition, hemolytic anemias are those which result from an increased RBC destruction coupled with an increased erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis, we all know, is the ability of the bone marrow to respond when anemia is unimpaired. Now, hemolytic anemias, we broadly classify it as either congenital or acquired. And congenital, of course, is that which is having a genetic basis, and acquired which has an acquired cause. So, the genetically determined hematological disorders can be mediated either through an autosomal recessive pattern, autosomal dominant pattern, or X-linked recessive pattern, and among each it has its own spectrum. Under the spectrum of autosomal recessive, thalassemia major and sickle cell anemia are important causes. If we consider the autosomal dominant spectrum, hereditary spherocytosis is included, and G6PD deficiency is an X-linked recessive hemolytic anemia. These examples are very important. Now, if we further classify hemolytic anemias, we can classify the source of the effect as either extrinsic or intrinsic. By extrinsic meaning the factor lies outside the RBC, and intrinsic meaning within the RBC. The extrinsic deficits can be because of isoimmune incompatibility, Rh incompatibility, heteroimmune causes, ABO incompatibility, autoimmune reaction, or the presence of infections and or toxins as well. Whereas, if we consider intrinsic defects can further be at different levels, namely either at the membrane, at the hemoglobin, or at the enzyme. Membranous defects are seen in hereditary spherocytosis, hemoglobin defects are seen in thalassemia and sickle cell anemia, and enzyme defects are seen in G6PD deficiency. G6PD, full form of course being glucose 6-phosphatase. Now, if we further study these a little bit more in detail, the intracorpuscular defects, that is intrinsic ones, which can be hereditary, include hemoglobinopathies, enzymopathies, or membrane cytoskeletal defects, and the acquired causes within can be paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. Whereas if we consider the extracorpuscular factors, that is extrinsic ones, the hereditary cause is only familial hemolytic uremic syndrome, whereas the acquired causes a list goes on and on with microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, toxic agents, drugs, infectious causes, and autoimmune agents as well. Now, we can also classify the hemolysis as either intravascular or extravascular. Intravascular hemolysis is seen in paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, transfusion reactions, autoimmune hemolytic anemias, which can be either cold or warm, further subclassified, which I'll come to later, or enzymopathies with severe oxidative stress. Extravascular causes are enzymopathies, hemoglobinopathies, membranopathies, and specifically the warm component of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Remember, this point is important. Cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia comes under the intravascular component and warm comes under the extravascular component. The management completely varies based on the mechanism of action. Now, if you consider hemolytic disorders as a whole and as a spectrum, the clinical features is somewhat similar, and the diagnosis is pretty much based on the peripheral smear and other blood parameter findings on investigations. On general examination, jaundice is commonly seen with presence of pallor and bossing of the skull. On systemic examination, splenomegaly will be noted. Hemoglobin might be normal to severely reduced. The MCV will be 99.9% of the time increased, with increased reticulocyte count, increase in unconjugated hemoglobin in bilirubin, as well as an increased LDH. I'll repeat the cardinal findings: presence of jaundice, presence of pallor with skull bossing, splenomegaly on abdominal examination, cardiac murmur might be present depending on the severity in other systemic findings. Hemoglobin will be either normal to severely reduced, markedly increased MCV, increased reticulocytes, unconjugated bilirubin will be elevated, and elevated LDH. Now, to further go on, if we go to the other more specific investigations, serum haptoglobin and serum hemopexin both will be reduced markedly. Urine urobilinogen will be increased. There will be an increased number of normoblasts and polychromasia noted on the blood film. If you do a bone marrow investigation, erythroid hyperplasia will be noted, and specifically in cases of intravascular hemolysis, there will be an increase in serum hemoglobin. This is the only exception where there will be an increase, and urine hemosiderin and hemoglobin both will be positive. Now, when I refer to polychromatic cells, I have just highlighted this one example here where the typical description of an RBC is altered, where the central pallor is not 1/3 of the size. Polychromasia of a slightish purplish hue will be noted. If you notice, all these cells here are normal. This entire spectrum of cells are normal, but these abnormal cells, what you see here, all show polychromasia. Now, if you consider the types of hemoglobin, we know that hemoglobin has various types, namely embryonic, fetal and adult. The embryonic hemoglobin of course varies based on the different chains which are present. We know that adult hemoglobin has 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. The embryonic hemoglobins, namely Gower and Portland, contain different chains, namely beta epsilon in Gower 1, alpha and epsilon in Gower 2, and beta gamma in Portland. Whereas a fetal hemoglobin F contains 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains. In adult hemoglobin, hemoglobin A, which is the most predominant variety, has 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. We know that this is the most common variety of normal, and 2 alpha 2 delta chains are seen in hemoglobin A2. Now, hemoglobin A appears at the first month of fetal life but doesn't become dominant because hemoglobin F continues to persist. And hemoglobin A2 is only a minor component that appears shortly before birth and remains at a very low level and of trace levels even after birth as well. The final hemoglobin distribution is achieved only at 6 months of age and may even be later. And it's very important to remember this statistic that more than 95% of adult hemoglobin is of hemoglobin A variety, less than 3.5% is hemoglobin A2, and the miscellaneous component has a predominant quantity of 2.5% of hemoglobin F. The key takeaway message here is hemoglobin A is the predominant hemoglobin what is present. Now, briefly about thalassemia. Thalassemia is an autosomal recessive disorder which is a single gene disorder and is because of a defect in the globin chain synthesis of hemoglobin. We subclassify the types of thalassemia into alpha and beta. Alpha thalassemia is because of a defect in the alpha chain and it is completely incompatible with life. So, surviving is next to impossible with alpha thalassemia. Whereas in beta thalassemia, you have beta major and beta minor. If it is major, the beta chain is completely absent and partially produced is there in the minor component. Now, if you again classify as alpha and beta for a little bit more in detail, alpha thalassemia is a silent carrier and it has the alpha thalassemia trait because of the presence of HbH, and it presents mostly as hydrops fetalis and it is completely incompatible with life. Whereas beta thalassemia has a silent carrier and presents as thalassemia trait, it might present as thalassemia intermedia or as thalassemia major. Coming to the pathophysiology of it, the hemoglobin consists of 2 pairs of amino acids, like I mentioned initially, the alpha and beta chains. Normally, like we said, there are 2 alpha and 2 beta chains, so our balance is normally maintained. If there is an imbalance in the production of these peptide chains, it results to abnormal hemoglobinopathies, and the unpaired peptide chains is what gets precipitated on the RBC membrane. The premature destruction of these RBCs in the bone marrow results in the premature destruction into the peripheral circulation, and as we all know, the sequestration occurs maximally at the spleen. So in the reticuloendothelial system of the spleen this occurs, and the persistence of the gamma chain even post fetal life also can play a factor. Now, increased fetal hemoglobin results in an increased high affinity for oxygen, which results in tissue hypoxia, because as we all know, the role of hemoglobin is to bind with oxygen and it is supposed to release the oxygen when it comes into the particular tissue. So oxygen should come here and the hemoglobin should come back and result in further binding. If this release does not occur, if there is too much of attachment of oxygen towards the hemoglobin also, it is not good. and that is precisely what happens if there is fetal hemoglobin. So as a result of which the stimulation of erythropoietin occurs, resulting in both medullary as well as extramedullary erythropoiesis. This expansion occurs in the bone marrow space with characteristic hemolytic phases, fractures of the long bones which are pathological in nature, splenomegaly of severe degree, and severe degree of anemia. Now, if you observe this clinical profile of thalassemia major, the typical apathetic phases is noted, and on examination, if you see, there is a massive splenomegaly in this child which is marked in the diagram. Of course, that is a clinical finding and cannot be shown in the video. Now, like you noticed in the first image, you have frontal bossing noted typically. Along with that, you also have a typical maxillary prominence, that is maxillary hyperplasia, and a flat nasal bridge as well. Hepatosplenomegaly was marked in the first image, and that was very easy to identify, and it can be picked up very easily on clinical examination. But a greenish brown complexion which is noted due to pallor, hemosiderosis as well as jaundice, and severe degree of persistent progressive anemia. These two words are very important, both persistent and progressive anemia, due to the needs of repeated transfusion. Because of the transfusion repetition, there is also a severe amount of iron overload, and this results in endocrine dysfunction, cardiac and liver dysfunction also. And there is also subsequent steady retardation in both the growth and development of the child. If you notice the peripheral smear of the child with thalassemia major, you can notice a typical target cells are present all over, and these target cells I will just highlight here so it's more evident. These are typical target cells. Along with that, you also have a variable degree of anisopoikilocytosis where you can see these particular cells here. The shape and morphology of these RBCs is completely altered. So these are all far from normal, and even the other cells to a larger degree have a larger amount of pallor than what is normal. Now further continuing, these target cells, pencil cells, helmet cells, all different varieties. Target cells of course are more easily seen, can be seen on a peripheral smear, and comparatively the hemoglobin and hematocrit is very low compared to the reticulocytosis what is noted. The mutation also occurs in the beta globin chain expression. The diagnosis is typically done by hemoglobin electrophoresis where the fetal hemoglobin is observed. 2 alpha and 2 gamma chains of course are confirmatory of the diagnosis depending on the amount which is present quantitatively. If you take an X-ray of the skull, what you typically see here is a hair on end appearance, which is because of the increased diploic space in between the skull bones. Easy way to remember the mnemonic is the hair appears like it is spiked, hair on end appearance. Now other types of thalassemia, like I mentioned, we have the minor types as well as intermedia. The intermedia type is where both are double heterozygous and it appears later in onset with a moderate degree of anemia with hepatosplenomegaly. The peripheral smear picture will be more or less the same, but the difference appears in the electrophoresis picture. Now coming to the thalassemia minor type, again it is heterozygous, but more or less it is almost normal investigations wise. The difference is the peripheral smear will appear like a severe iron deficiency anemia variety. And the management of thalassemia minor is by anemia correction of PAC cells, excess iron removal by chelation therapy with desferrioxamine, specifically managing and preventing transfusion transmitted infections and complications, and management of cardiac as well as endocrine complications whichever might arise if any. When I say complications, pituitary complications such as delayed onset puberty, hypothyroidism, hypoparathyroidism, and delayed puberty because of gonadal dysmaturity is also common. Splenectomy is sometimes indicated in case of hypersplenism, and treatment of osteopenia, leg ulcers and gallstones is indicated, but this is somewhat of a rarer complication and is not always seen. The important ones are the first three because transfusion is a mainstay for these children, chelation therapy will be required, and management of transfusion transmitted infections is a must. The only curative definitive therapy is by stem cell transplantation, which is of course rarely done, but it can be prevented by early prenatal diagnosis as well as genetic counseling. Transfusion regimens in thalassemia of course vary. We have a palliative regimen, a moderate regimen, and a hypertransfusion regimen also. The palliative regimen is where we aim to maintain a hemoglobin of 8.5 gram %, where it is not a completely normal child, but at the same time it is not a completely deficit also. A moderate transfusion is where we aim to maintain between 9 to 10.5, which is normal. And irrespective of the deficiency, if from a 4 or a 5 we aim to get it to a 10, keeping 10 as a gold standard, then it becomes a hypertransfusion regimen. The term super transfusion is self-explanatory, where super, of course, where we aim to step up very severely, and ultimately the aim in a super transfusion is to get the hemoglobin to 12 gram %, but the risk of overload is proportionately higher. And neocyte transfusion is one of those recent advances where we aim to reduce the interval between the transfusions. A little bit about chelation therapy. Iron overload is a complication which is seen because of the repeated requirement of transfusions. Excess gastrointestinal absorption and the lack of mechanism for an excretion of iron from the body, and like I mentioned earlier, repeated transfusion of red cell are all factors which result in iron overload. Chelation is always to be started when serum ferritin levels go more than 1000. So that mark is important. And or if the liver iron reservoirs go more than 2500 microgram per gram of dry weight of liver. So these are the two criteria at which we start a chelation therapy, among which serum ferritin levels is better easily measured because you can go ahead without doing a biopsy. The drugs used for chelation therapy predominantly are desferrioxamine, which is commonly used as a parenteral drug, apart from which we also have deferriox and defeperone, both. Desferrioxamine is strictly an IV regimen, it is a parenteral route, whereas the other two remain as oral forms and is chosen according to the requirement of the case. A little bit about sickle cell disease. We all know that sickle cell anemia is because of the mutation of the amino acid at the 6th position of the beta globin chain. Glutamate is replaced by malic acid. The deoxy sickle cell hemoglobin becomes polymerized, which results in an increased calcium influx, potassium leakage. Stiff, vicious sickle cell results in veno-occlusion, which can result in microinfarcts and ischemic pains, rarely resulting in autoinfarction of the spleen. It also causes a decreased RBC survival, which results in anemia, jaundice, gallstones, and leg ulcers. Predominantly, the pathology is the shape of the cell becomes sickled and the normal biconcave shape is lost in the sickle cell. Important to note, sickle cell being autosomal recessive can only manifest if homozygous. X-linked recessive. I correct myself. Only if X-linked recessive, it can present if it is homozygous. Heterozygous individuals remain either as trait or carrier, and these individuals generally remain asymptomatic, and it only manifests under a severe stress situation, which can manifest clinically either in the form of crisis or hypoxia or sepsis, etc. If you consider the hemoglobin electrophoresis pattern, the typical pattern of HbS will be more than 80%, HbF will be in the range of 1 to 20, and HbA2 will be in the 4.5% range. Characteristically and typically, the sickling test will become positive. Sickling test is nothing but you add the reducing agent, and if the precipitate comes, it becomes positive. If it remains clear and turbid, it remains sickling negative. When I say crisis, aplastic crisis is where severe anemia of bone marrow suppression, typically because of parvovirus B19 infection. Hyperhemolytic crisis is where there is severe hemolysis in a peripheral circulation and in the reticuloendothelial system. Vaso-occlusive crisis can be seen in hand-foot-mouth disease, avascular necrosis of bones, acute chest syndrome, stroke, priapism, and even in a painful abdominal crisis also. And a sequestration crisis is where shock occurs because of pooling of blood in the reticuloendothelial system, specifically in the spleen and the liver. Each of these 4 examples are important to be enumerated where crisis comes up. Now, briefly about the pathophysiology of hereditary spherocytosis. We know that hereditary spherocytosis is autosomal dominant, and it is because of the spectrin and ankyrin deficiency which results in a membrane defect. Now, this membrane defect, if we consider it, there is a sodium pump failure, and that is again because of the spectrin and ankyrin deficiency. This pump failure results in an influx of sodium and water, resulting in the loss of the biconcave shape, which results in the spherical shape of microspherocytosis. It presents with a clinical triad of anemia, jaundice, and splenomegaly, and complications include hemolytic and aplastic crisis as well as gallstones. Spherocytosis is characteristically noted on peripheral smear, and osmotic fragility is increased. The only specific treatment is splenectomy, and family members are to be screened for genetic counseling purpose. If you consider G6PD deficiency, it is 9 out of 10 times asymptomatic and gets manifested only when exposed to oxidant drugs. It results in intravascular hemolysis because of hemoglobinuria, Heinz bodies present, as well as blister cells in peripheral smear also. G6PD estimation is often diagnostic in value. Now, when we consider these known oxidant insults, like I was talking, antibacterials which can cause this include chloramphenicol, nitrofurantoin, sulfonamide, and trimethoprim sulfomethoxazole combination. The antimalarials which are typically known to cause this are primaquine and chloroquine, and always before starting any of these antimalarials, it is important to know the G6PD status. It is very typical to know the G6PD status before beginning. The chemicals which can cause this, of course, can be benzene, naphthalene, and phenylhydrazine. Illnesses like diabetic ketoacidosis, hepatitis, as well as sepsis can also cause it. But this miscellaneous segment is where I would like to focus, because probenecid is commonly used in the treatment of gout. Aspirin is commonly given sometimes as NSAIDs, even in JIA. Vitamin K analogs sometimes are given in bleeding tendencies. Methylene blue is also rarely given. So it is important to note that G6PD deficiency individuals, if given some other drug, can sometimes be precipitated into a crisis-like situation. Now, coming to PNH, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, it is because of acquired chronic hemolytic anemia. It is a characteristically persistent intravascular hemolysis, and it presents as pancytopenia with hemoglobinuria noted along with hemosideruria, as well as an increased LDH and bilirubin levels on lab investigations. The risk of venous thrombosis is proportionately higher, and it presents as hemoglobinuria typically during the night time, and hence the name. On bone marrow, it is completely normal, and a rare differential diagnosis which we have to keep in mind can be done based on flow cytometry for CD59 and CD55 analogs, and is confirmed based on Ham's acidified serum test. The name of this test is important. Now, coming to autoimmune hemolytic anemia, this is one of the last spectrum which we'll be covering. It is because of RBC destruction due to autoantibodies which are produced in the RBCs. We classify this as primary and secondary. I'll cover secondary first because it is quite simple and straightforward. Secondary autoimmune hemolytic anemias are seen because of drugs, infections, primary immune deficiency, malignancies, and other autoimmune disorders like systemic lupus and discoid lupus. If you consider primary autoimmune conditions, we further subclassify that as warm and cold. The warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias are because of the antibody binding at 37 degrees centigrade, that is IgG component, whereas the cold portion combines at 4 degrees centigrade, that is the IgM and the complement components of it. And the paroxysmal part, the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, is because of the binding of IgG and the complement both. Now, the management wise both differ. It's not mentioned in the slides, but I will just mention it. Warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, the management is corticosteroids according to the dose and according to the weight of the child. And the cold component, the management is rituximab. And rituximab, as we all know, is a CD20 inhibitor. So rituximab is a drug of choice for the management of cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and warm is managed by corticosteroids. But one point which I would like to stress, the evidence in the management of autoimmune hemolytic anemias is proportionately less. So even if you consider the latest databases like Cochrane, the amount of evidence is proportionately less, and it does remain symptomatic and experimental therapies. This slide is just a summary to conclude whatever I have spoken all this while. Hemolytic anemias are easily recognized based on the clinical.
This final slide basically summarizes whatever I spoke about in the entire presentation. So just to conclude, hemolytic anemia is recognized by the clinical picture, easily identified based on short history, simple physical examination, and basic lab tests. Hemolysis is pathognomically present, and most of the changes are seen on peripheral smear examination. If you consider spherocytes specifically, spherocytes are specifically noted in autoimmune hemolytic anemias and hereditary spherocytosis. The presence of schistocytes is almost always pathognomic towards hemolytic uremic syndrome, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura DIC, or heart valve hemolysis specifically. The presence of blister cells goes in favor of oxidative damage seen in G6PD deficiency. The presence of sickle cells, as the name itself suggests, goes towards sickle cell anemia, and Heinz bodies are characteristically seen in G6PD deficiency. On that note, I come to the end of this presentation and thank IAP for ensuring the slides are made available online, and thank you all for patiently listening to the presentation, and hope you tune into the next video also.